Okay, a very good evening, everyone. Welcome to the webinar of the Consumer Culture Lab. And I'm really excited and eagerly waiting to start today's webinar. We have a very special guest today with us, Mr. Santosh Desai. So before I introduce him, I thought I'll just give you a very brief introduction about the Consumer Culture Lab. So our Consumer Culture Lab is basically a hub for qualitative research on the Indian consumer culture. And it's like a one of its kind center by an educational institute, in fact, in the entire Asia Pacific region. And the goal of the lab is basically to conduct some deep research on the Indian consumer culture and also work as a platform to connect academia with industry in the Indian consumer research space. And we had set this lab up in 2020. And earlier this year, we had launched a report called Rangbhumi, which was a study about the content creators from small towns in India. So I would urge you all to try to check out that report at our website as well. It's cclab.imu.ac.in. So, I mean, that was just a brief introduction about our lab. And I would also like to now introduce the people in this panel today. So I am Professor Tanvi Gupta. I am a marketing faculty at IIM Udaipur. And I co-chair the lab with Professor Rajesh Nanapura. He is an associate professor of marketing at IIM Udaipur as well. And Adishri Guha and Sayantande, they are researchers working with us at the lab. So Adishri is our senior research executive and Sayantan is our research assistant. And now I would like to introduce you to our speaker. I mean, he needs no introduction. Basically, if anyone is working in the space of consumer research and cultural research in India, the first name that anyone would think of is Santosh Desai. He is kind of like the pioneer of cultural research in the Indian space. And Mr. Santosh Desai, he's a CEO of Future Brands Limited. And he's an author, columnist, and a social commentator. I mean, I think most of us would have read some of his insightful columns that he has been writing for the Times of India for the last 17 years now. So Santosh is basically what you would call as the brand guru. So he is an IIM Ahmedabad graduate, and he has in the past served as the president of the McCann Erickson group, which is one of the leading ad agencies in the world. And he has like 21 years of experience in advertising. So he's like a veteran in this space. And he has been involved in strategically building a lot of brands in the Indian market space. And of course, I mean, one thing which for me, like the most inspiring content that I have seen from Santosh Desai is his book, Mother Pious Lady. So as a student myself, it was kind of like a compulsory reading for any student who is interested to learn to even understand the Indian consumer culture. So Mother Pious Lady, if you haven't read this book, I mean, you need to seriously go and read this book. So he has written this book, which actually is a very nuanced take on understanding the evolution of the consumer culture in middle class India. So he has done a lot of very nuanced and interesting work in the consumer research space in India. And today we have the privilege of having him talk to us about a very interesting topic, which is the changing meaning of romance, tracing the evolution of the idea of romance and the role it plays at the individual and societal level. So it's a very interesting topic. And I would like to hand over to Santosh to take us through this. And any of you, whenever you have any questions, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. So once Santosh finishes his presentation, we'll open up for Q&A at the end. So I'll hand it over to Santosh. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Tanvi. That was a very kind introduction. I really do appreciate it. What I'm going to do today is to just run you through, the idea of romance and how it has evolved over the years. When I actually suggested this subject, I hadn't really put a presentation or my thoughts together. When I put them together, they turned out to be really large and kind of, seem to take up a lot of time. So what I've done is I've tried to crunch it and sort of, and I might therefore just run through some aspects of the presentation. Anything that you want to clarify or discuss or disagree with, please feel free to do so after my talk. I will try and leave enough time for conversation, because I think that'd be really important. So without further ado, let me get into romance Kal Aaj Aur Kal. When we talk about romance in India, at one level, I grew up in a time when in the so if I was an adolescent, let's say in the 70s and 80s, and romance was something that wasn't uh, as visible a visible part of society as it is today. It's not as if we did not have a history or a culture, or we didn't have a cultural vocabulary of romance. There's enough romance. If you look at the cultural history of India, there is enough by way of art. There is enough by way of mythology. There are stories. There is Ras Leela. There is Shringar Ras. There's erotic art, of course. And a celebration of body and sensuality, music, which has many romantic rags. So it isn't as if we lack a vocabulary of romance. But at some point, this vocabulary seemed to have run dry. I think if you look at the way in which society was constructed, there was almost this very clear attempt to sort of control and contain instinct and impulse of all kind. And therefore, one of the big aspects of control was this idea of ensuring continuity by not allowing individuals too much sway. And romance was one place where individual impulse ruled, and therefore it needed to be controlled. Marriage was in India visualized as a contract between families, consummated almost incidentally by the bride and groom. The bride and groom were almost like incidental figures in the fact that families came together, and there was a ladka and there was a ladki, and this infantilizing of the protagonists. And so you could have a 35-year-old guy who looked like a truck but would be referred to as a ladka, and because there was this sense ki inhe kya pata, meaning what do they know, right? There's essentially it was something managed by the elders, and these two people were happened to be the instruments of consummation. Romance limited even within marriage. I mean, there were some very innovative devices to ensure that even within marriage, romance was not necessarily. Or one is the fact that, which I find quite interesting, is the fact that in a lot of regions in India, in fact, most regions in India, the wife did not call the husband by name. I mean, you refer to as AG or Sunte Ho or Mohan ke Papa. I mean, you think about it, one way of ensuring that intimacy does not occur between individuals is actually to cut off their very identity. I mean, you know each other by roles, and you perform roles rather than actually having engineering a sort of a personal intimacy. And I remember that, in my family, for instance, if in a joint family situation, if a husband came and sat down next to a wife, the wife would get up and sit somewhere else. It was almost like even sitting next to each other was considered as a sign of affection that was not okay in a public domain. I think overall, if you think about what, this whole idea of middle class values, what we called middle class values was nothing but an elaborate protocol of controlling women. I mean, and the fear that women, and the fact that they, in a joint family situation, a young bride was seen as a threat who needed to be neutralized, because she could potentially sort of break up the family and destroy the continuity of the family. And this was ingrained in many norms that we saw at the time. Post-marriage rituals also focused on fertility rather than on romance. The rituals like the Suhagrat, where sex was an act of public conformity and not personal intimacy. I mean, there are cultures in which you actually displayed the clothes of the bride to show that she was a virgin before marriage, and it is not that distant. I mean, it's something that there is memory of the fact that was prevalent at a certain point in time. And even the unseemly kind of, you imagine two strangers coming together who have really not interacted with each other, and the first thing that they're together is the conjugal night. I mean, which in a sense starts off the marriage virtually, where sex is a performance, which is a social performance, rather than an organic evolution of a relationship. Good news needed to be manufactured quickly. Can be good news aaya, which means you needed the pregnancy was something that was expected, so that you quickly move on the role from being a bride to being a mother, and therefore the time between the two was minimized. And also over a period of time, what was almost like, I've had people tell me the fact that the kind of food that they were made to eat during pregnancy was to ensure that once you are a mother, you had a mother's body and not a lover's body. So it's almost like there is an attempt to very clearly demarcate and make a transition from one kind of a role to another. Romance, when it existed, was chupke chupke. So many film songs celebrate this chat pe aana, or this jhuki nazare, and the whole coyness around romance, surreptitious letters, telephone calls, the temporary balm to the anguish of being kept apart. This was the whole thing. It was just, you were largely separated, but occasionally you sort of had some contact. I remember in college at that time, the way in which propose, well, you slip a note in somebody's notebook, and that was the best that you could do. Romance outside marriage was seen as a grave transgression. There was clearly something that was frowned upon, and particularly for the girl. A girl found in the company of a boy inviting reputational ruin, and there was this magic jungle drums kind of a thing where you meet a girl or vice versa somewhere, and within 5 minutes you may not have a telephone at home, but somehow magically within 5 minutes your parents knew that you had met someone. Ultimately marrying for love, and that's the whole love marriage. And there were again many films that talked about the whole idea of love marriage and how it was almost something that was a disruptive act, and that threatened reputations of multiple parties involved. Marriage itself could be devoid of any romance, even whether within the safe sort of construct of a marriage. Very often there were two perpetual strangers locked in patriarchal in a death embrace, where they were locked into with each other, but they really did not have much in common. They did not have conversation. They performed roles with each other rather than actually go through a intimate relationship. Sex, according to, using Sudhir Kakkar's word, was often a sharp stab of lust, something done to rather than done with. It was almost, it had that kind of a quality. And man was much more secure in his role, but women often yearning for, again, to use Kakkar's word, two-person universe, this idea of an intimacy where she and the man are together, and there is a sense of this almost closed space that they inhabit, which they were left yearning for because of the fact that marriage very often turned out to be a sterile relationship insofar as romance was concerned. On the other hand, it could also result. So this was one type of marriage, but you also had a lot of also some marriages that could resulted in a deep but undemonstrative kind of affection, which was not romance in the sense in which we would know the word today. There was certainly no candlelight, there was certainly no flowers, there was certainly no gifts, there was certainly no dinners, just the two people sort of enjoying within, and which would have the label of romance. But almost like stubborn forbearance, two people learning about each other, enduring each other's idiosyncrasies till such time as they meld almost into wordless compatibility, which you saw a lot of marriages, a lot of parents' marriages. Our archetype was this, where over a period of time it was a rock solid relationship, but it was formed by, not through romance, was not the vehicle, as much as the idea of understanding, adjustment, and finally really getting a sense of the other person, being the vehicle for that kind of a relationship. But overall still, there were a large legion of disappointed women, a lot of women who at a certain age, when they look back upon their life, and we have done a lot of work talking to women of this kind who have this nagging sense of incompleteness at their life, at the fact that there was just being unfulfilled romantically, being unfulfilled, finding themselves disappointed in their husbands. The reason why it was more women than men is because men got to speak their minds, and women did not. So there was an asymmetry here. Bollywood was the escape valve. It acknowledged desires, but it also neutralized them. It did both. So while there were a lot of young couples and there was a lot of love song, but it worked within the larger framework of society. So there was always a legitimacy of the parents was always uppermost. Legitimacy was institutions was always reinforced, but there was always this kind of so the villain was circumstances, the villain was the outside world, and then you tried to negotiate some sort of a settlement with circumstances. There were notable exceptions in terms of films, but by and large, this was the story. And the overall depiction of romance was located in this fantastical kind of a world. You had these, of course, the soul singing songs while, in trees and in mountains and hill stations. I mean, that the idea of romance almost needed to be located in an otherworldly, in a fantasy world, because it could not reside in everyday life. So it, by necessity, you had to relocate to what was transparently an imaginary space. So you created this imaginary space in which to locate any notion of romance, and it provided a release for a lot of people, but clearly distancing from reality. The Bollywood song being a very important component. I mean, this is up to a certain generation, even today to a certain extent, but in a very different way, perhaps. The idea of the Bollywood song as something that was the song of your inarticulate heart. I mean, you did not have the vocabulary to speak. You did not have the means of expressing, nor the opportunity. Half the time, you had romantic ideas about people who did not know you existed, and so this became a vocabulary which became a powerful vocabulary, helping them articulate, express their love and desires. And it was almost like thought blurbs in poetry. It was a poetic, so extremely poetic, which is the reason why you have a vocabulary in Hindi cinema which is again far removed from everyday life, very Urdu, very kind of and all kinds of words that we actually really don't know what they mean. A lot of people use those words but that was part of the poetic expression of the time. We saw some change in the 70s and 80s. The youth love story films like Bobby and Julie came in, which I was growing up at that time. I can tell you they were like so profoundly significant because they also had a physical aspect. A song like Hum Tum Ek Kamre Mein Band Ho, which for most of the young audience perhaps would not even have heard of that song, or Chabi Kho Jaye. That idea, कि भाई चाबी खो जाए हम तुम्हें कमरे में बंद हो, was that the deliciousness of that thrill for a younger generation was really unbelievable. Then we also saw the coming of the westernized heroine, removed from reality but representing again a new archetype. Also, we saw some marriage films. We started seeing some beginning of real life romance in the whole Amol Palekar, Rishikesh Mukherjee, Basu Chatterjee kind of films, which had a more kind of a less top of over the top kind of a depiction of romance. Also some marriage films dealing with the aftermath of romance. So therefore, from a purely fantasy kind of an area, starting to locate it more in everyday life, starting to open out representations, and also deal with some of the realities of marriage. The word love and the idea of love was still somewhat alien. The word love was almost like an exotic confection, something borrowed, something when you spoke of, you had to put it in quotes. It had its own cultural surround. Angrezi mein kehte hain I love you, meaning it's almost like teaching you that this is what it is, or ilu, which is this ridiculous kind of a shortened form of I love you. But so it's interesting as to how you were coming to terms with an idea and trying to locate it more in everyday life. I think the big change came with liberalization when it inadvertently sort of almost ushered in the dawn of the couple for a bunch of reasons. The rise of nuclear families, relocating to larger cities, much needed breathing room for young couples to thrive, consumption itself being a driver of romance. You had movies to go to, you had malls you could visit. So there were spaces, there were activities that you went out, you left home more. There was personal mobility. You had two-wheelers come in, and therefore it became possible. The radius of your existence grew dramatically, and you could sort of go venture out much further into the world. For women, particularly, personal mobility was a radical, revolutionary kind of an idea, because you could go unchaperoned to various places. You were not dependent on men to travel. So away from the surveillance of the joint family, the early thrill of referring to each other as girlfriend and boyfriend. So there was this whole sense of newness that came in with that idea that you could Also, there was much greater romantic activity. Unlike if you look at representations of romance in an earlier time, basically you looked at each other and sang songs, or you moved around trees, or there was nothing to do. I mean, you just gazed soulfully into each other's eyes and sang songs. I mean, that was a representation. Today, there was so much, at this time now, there was so much more to do. You could go to a mall, you could go to a movie together, you go to a restaurant. The idea of romantic activity, I think, became much more sort of commonplace. College fests and events is a way to meet somebody. Cinema too populated with themes about romantic negotiations. So the Dilwale Dulhania, etc. What you see is from, even now there is opposition, but there's actual negotiation taking place. It does not happen because of some shift in circumstances that problems get solved. Problems get solved by talking about it, by confronting them, by dealing with them. So there is a shift that happens here. And also this pining, very Persian form of love, where love was felt most strongly when it was denied, when you were in pain. That as the archetype of love, to love having a sense of pleasure and optimism. So you began to see that shift. Commercialization of romance as a shortcut to convey the bigness of emotions. Well, this was the era of the Archie's gallery, where it became possible. You still do not have the means to express yourself. You still do not have the vocabulary, but you could buy a teddy bear instead. You had greeting cards instead. So it became possible to communicate and create this lexicon of romance through via medias and intermedias that were commercially available. Over time, habituating a young generation to new modes of romance, anniversaries, Valentine's Day, these are all stepping stones which actually train people that romance is a part of life, romance is a necessary part of life, romance, and this is the protocol for working with romance. So it's almost like, and Valentine's Day, I think, is a purely market-driven kind of a promotion of the idea of romance. So taking a kind of a burgeoning need, something that was beginning to become manifest, it's a basic human need, which was becoming socially more acceptable. Socially, it was becoming becoming a social imperative almost. And here you had the market accelerating and catalyzing that process. And so Valentine's Day became the crystallization of pent-up desires, providing legitimacy to this instinct as well as an excuse for exercising it, concentrating scattered desires into this singular event, this one day, and it also evoked societal anxiety. And you saw a lot of protests against it, particularly political protests against it, but in an increasingly feeble way. Over a period of time, it was unstoppable. I mean, you had all kinds of incidents take place on Valentine's Day, but over a period of time, it became an institution almost. Of course, the big change, I think, happening, like with a lot of things in India, with the mobile phone, it changed everything. It's a direct pipeline between people. It's a direct pipeline between me and the outside world. It is, it gives me anonymity. It is a hotline of a kind. It's a personal and secret relationship with the outside. So this whole thing of having to step outside home, all of those constraints suddenly went out of the window. Everybody was in the outside world. Plus, I could broadcast. Not only could I receive, but it's a two-way relationship where I actually can impose myself on the world. So it is a profoundly sort of radical sort of a shift that came as a result of the mobile phone. It also, you had spaces, the social media was spaces meant for social interaction. They were created. That is the only thing that they did. If you think about Facebook, it is nothing but a sort of a place where, public square. Most of these things are nothing but public journals. Actually, they are just diaries where everybody can write at the same time, and they can interact with each other. So actually, if you think about it, their essential role is only social interaction. Also, the great ability to advertise oneself and put oneself out there. So you're forever in a place where you can present yourself to the world. And I think that opportunity became, therefore, it's almost like a free kind of a rein to your all kinds of impulses, including the romantic ones. The other big thing that happened with liberalization and coming of mobile phone particularly is learning to make choices. This is the first generation that has choices to make. In an earlier Hindi film, when there was a romantic triangle, one person had to die because there was no way somebody could choose. You couldn't say, I prefer this guy. the other guy had to die. That's the only way, because you were only when you were deprived of choices could you move on. The idea that you choose one over the other was actually something that was alien. Learning to choose between things is actually is a skill that we picked up post liberalization, where we started actually being able to, and also having the options to choose from. And again, for in the romantic context, the idea of having more than one relationship was a novel one. And in the earlier era, if somebody had an earlier relationship, it was referred to very darkly as having a past. It was muttered darkly that, oh, she has a past. I mean, it was not something. The idea of serial relationships was actually, idea of any relationship was considered to be transgressive, but having more than one was certainly more than was very extremely transgressive. In small towns too, I think there was a marked change. We see this today. We see this, the freedom to talk about crushes. I remember this conversation we are having with people in Gorakhpur, and Gorakhpur is a place where still there is extreme segregation. Once the college we went to had a boys' canteen and a girls' canteen that was separate. There were parts of UP that we went to where there was a wall between in the class separating the boys and the girls. Actually, a wall. But even there, we found that there was this ability to talk about crushes, and with no hope of that crush ever being realized, but the ability to talk about it, to say, okay, I have a crush on, and my crush did this, and it was interesting. Also, we saw in other parts of small in India, college only relationships, where there were people were in relationships knowing very well it could never mean anything else. But during college, you enjoyed college the most if you were in a relationship, because then you could do many more things if you were together. So we saw that. We also saw the fear of marriage. Very notably in Haryana, we came across these a bunch of these girls in this college who were, and a large number of women pursuing the PhD, and a very strong animating reason for that was the fact that they wanted to avoid marriage. And avoid getting married. So the more you study, the chance of, And we also came across interesting subterfuge, of this new thing called bhai friends. So instead of a boyfriend, he's not a boyfriend, but he's a bhai friend. So it's not a bhai. It's not the Mubola bhai of the Raki brother, but it is this new hybrid thing called bhai friend. So, whom you can go with on bikes with, you can watch movies with, but he's apparently safe. A loosening relationship with sex, that you have start seeing more matter-of-fact acknowledgement of its need. We came across these young girls in Bhubaneswar who they're talking about having boyfriends, and when asked about sex, they said, meaning they spend a lot of money on us, so that is normal. I mean, sex is expected. It was unusual, that kind of but we come across this more and more and more, seen as more intrinsic to a relationship, and has been reflected in the cinema of the time. This is true even in peri-urban India. I think romance in peri-urban India actually plays a slightly different role. It's almost like a lever of change. And we saw this, in some areas where women would talk about the fact that now it was okay for them when they traveled on a bike in front of village elders, she could put her arm around his waist. And whereas earlier she could not, and now she could. And it was such an act of liberation. And for the man also, the idea of romance forces him to acknowledge women as individuals much more. There is a certain softening that takes place, and you can see the emerging agency of women here. So overall, again, this is not today as much as the evolution that happened post liberalization. So we had romance as a social disruptor in the early days. The romance, its codes were of yearning and pining. The romance was an experiment. It was something that only few people did. Romance immediately after the liberalization has heady freedom. This whole opening out of options, of activities. Romance as lifestyle, which you need in college, and romance as almost learned protocol. So this is the kind of a transition that you've seen. Today, I think if I talk about it, we are seeing a fundamental shift of many kinds. I'm not talking about romance, but overall, this is a generation which has had to see lots of things happening at the same time. We know all of these. I'm not going to labor this. There's digital overload. There's Work opportunities have multiplied, options have multiplied. It is possible for you to be to do conventional work. It is possible to become an influencer. I mean that the opportunities are manifold. The pressure to succeed and benchmarks of success have also gone up. 19-year-olds are billionaires, so you can never be too successful. Horizontal aspirations have grown. So your aspirations earlier was, I want to join a particular kind of institute. I want to, you had linear goals. Today you have to be several things at the same time. It's not enough just to be a great student. You have to be a foodie. You have to be, you have to do several things at the same time. And so therefore it is in that sense both an extremely opportune moment to be young and a terrifying moment to be young, because of the combination of opportunity and pressure. I think most importantly, this is a generation that needs to build its own compass. Authority figures, though defanged, have nothing to offer by way of guidance. Nobody has grown up in a social media and a digital world. The older generation is also coping, and so therefore there is no great guidance it can give. Friends are key, but there is also much more pressure on friendships. We've just done some work on this, which say that friends are vital, but also there's so much more pressure. There is so much more demands that are made on friends that they are often fragile. Work codes have changed beyond recognition, as we all know. Age is no longer a clue to life patterns. If you're 21-year-old, you could be doing anything. I mean, there's no way of saying 21 means you are doing X. So the correspondence between age and life patterns has been dismantled. And of course, there is fluidity of identity in so many different ways. Gender, sexuality, the fact that you need to be so many things at the same time. So they have to figure out, this is a generation that has to figure out everything themselves. Having grown up in relative comfort, they have a natural expectation of success, but that is not necessarily fulfilled. Want all kinds of needs to be fulfilled simultaneously. Struggle in the face of setbacks. Because again, it's not easy. The equipment to handle setbacks is not as well developed, perhaps, as in the past. And mental health, therefore, is a big emerging issue. So it's just the background to romance. So there's a much more consumption-driven existence. That idea seems to seep into the notion of romance. It's a generation, because it is caught up in the abundance of choice. Being consumer is a key mode of being. So it is true at multiple stages in life in terms of what to study. You look at what it will get you, what kind of a life it will buy you. You don't just do it because you like a subject or you got X number of marks, etc. What career to choose, what to wear, what to eat, all of it. Similarly, mating has become a much freer market. You see the dating apps come in, which are literally allowing you to shop. So there is an explorative angle to romance, which is not hinged completely on commitment. Romance is no longer straightforward or linear. Each relationship is entered into with your personal goals, which at different stages is different. It is not necessarily for the relationship to be serious to convert into marriage. So therefore, the space for what a relationship means, what it translates into, what you're seeking from it, all of it is much more fluid. In fact, a new vocabulary of romance that captures this transience, which is not, crushes, my exes, the idea of exes, the whole dumping, ghosting, benching, situationship, and a whole set of new words needing to be invented to reflect the new realities that you're dealing with. So there's no longer simple linear kind of a spectrum. There is actually a whole lot of different kind of relationship statuses that needs to be captured. It is a market to shop. I mean, you're virtually finding a partner off the shelf. You're choosing, you are literally flipping through choices. You're swiping right, you're swiping left. And even without the dating apps, the process is the same. Your sense of, because there is a certain transience that is built into the idea, there is always this kind of a shopping kind of a mindset. There's a license to be super choosy and discerning, finding exactly what you want. Because also it's easy to break off within the first few interactions. It's possible to sort of, it's not such a big deal. And this sense which we find, of being said often, that I can easily find love again. You also find its opposite, that I'm struggling really hard, but I'm not finding the right person. The entire spectrum exists. Much more performative element to romance. a certain thrill to flaunting your significant other, enjoying likes and comments, dramatizing big and small moments of love, increasingly a space to also vent about hookups and breakups. So, for instance, this couple on the right, they were trolled for a honeymoon photo shoot, but they refused to take it down because it just this idea of a outwardliness that you find of which is true beyond romance, which is true generally as a mode of being, but certainly also true of romance, something that was very much deemed to be in the private sphere earlier, partly because there was a fear of the external gaze of what would people think, and here we see a fairly significant difference take place here. Each aspect of the relationship getting foregrounded, every little milestone getting airtime. Apparently, there's something called soft launching, which is a new celebrity where you launch the relationship. So it's almost like a marketing campaign. But the idea of advertising relationships is extremely common. You also curate yourself for love. So you prepare yourself. The online dating profile is a creative canvas, painstakingly built and obsessed over. I mean, it's something that takes time. It is, again, this is true in a larger sense where your DP, how you present yourself, your bio, all of them are something that you need to really craft, but nothing more than the online dating profile. You have to be at your best. Also, a new cadence of introduction. I mean, it just makes everything so easy. The hesitation of an earlier time, the tentativeness, the cost, and the fear of getting rejected, all of them get minimized in a context like today. We are also seeing women as agents of romance in relationships, more insistently nudging reluctance out of men. There is a much greater sort of and very often it's a relationship is difficult to tell as to who's defining the relationship, because there is a much greater equality in the way relationships are managed. Arranged marriage is a repackaged to look like marriages, so love marriages. So you find so much of the backstory, which is sometimes often invented, because there needs to be this is a Bollywoodization of the imagination, where you are the hero, I am the heroine, and you perform as if we were in Bollywood. And in a literal sense, the marriage function and all the events are littered with Bollywood songs. Every event has a Bollywood song. So when you enter the Fera, there is a thing. Everything is a Bollywood. So it's almost set to a Bollywood track. And this idea of the fantasticness of your personas is, I think, something that you see here. And tradition in other ways also redesigned to accommodate romance in rituals, even in marriage. Karwa Chauth, for instance, you see this whole the romantic layers that have been put onto Karwa Chauth. So instead of it being something that women did, men did not really understand, and it happened as a ritual of sacrifice to a ritual of celebration, of a joint celebration. Increasingly is a shift that has happened. This is for the first time a generation that is co-learning romance. It is virtually learning romance. It is learning romance. It is approaching it as if it were work. Bit by bit by bit, they are constructing the notion of romance in a full sense. They were idealized ideas of romance. They were borrowed ideas of romance. Now what you're doing is you're taking those ideas, now you're reenacting them, but in granular detail, and then overlaying the soundtrack to that, which is still fantastic and Bollywoodized. With a more nuanced romantic vocabulary, relationships are becoming far more complex, rapidly evolving expectations from each other. While simultaneously, you already are in a world which is complex, which is exceedingly difficult in many ways, a lot of pressure. And here you have two people who also have very high expectations from each other, which are evolving all the time. There is a plethora of choice and nothing is a given. So it is a difficult time, just as much as there is plenty of romantic opportunity. Also, therefore, there's far more granular evaluation of romantic performance, specific and multiple expectations from each other, far more things one can get wrong, and there's an impatience with imperfectness. So there is in that sense this kind of a romantic, very often romantic crisis this is really significant that we found that playing the role of both partner and therapist, crucial for the survival of modern day love. I mean, as many people talked about the fact that, the fact that when they overheard some, their children talking, it was almost as if they were therapizing each other. I mean, there is actually much more than just the thrills, being there for each other through good and bad, acting as each other's support system, helping them navigate the intricacies of today's world. It's this almost like a dichotomy. There's a much greater role for the partner because the partner is very important, is the one constant in a bewildering world, except that the partner is not a constant. That constancy of the relationship is not a given, but the need for stability is high. This is a generation that is, in any case, already fluent in therapy speak. Red flags, toxicity, for instance, a toxic person, toxic relationship is something that you find as common vocabulary. Setting boundaries, boundary drawing, calling out people who have made them uncomfortable. All of this ghosting, the whole vocabulary has a lot of therapy speak in it. There's also a knowledge economy of romance to tap into. There are a whole bunch of people who are how to flirt with a boy, how do I know if my crush likes me, etc., etc. A huge amount of content that is available to help guide and shape this new grammar of romance. And so romance has co-created well-being rather than only flaming passion, desire, pleasure. So there's that is the new kind of a code of romance. Also, the word partner is so indicative of the fact that you think of somebody. It's almost like at one level, it's like being in a VC firm or being in a consultancy where you're partners, right? It has that kind of a feeling to it, but it's also collaborative. The idea that, so instead of it being romance or boyfriend, girlfriend, also the idea of the partner. And also it sits on the intersections of many other intersections, identity politics, gender, sexuality, all of them. The word partner, in a sense, has a careful neutrality about it. There's also capitalist era setting a tenor of romance work, coupledom as an achievement engine. Virtually, there is this sense of the ROI mental model of relationships. What am I getting out of it? What you put in and what you get out. Relationship is requiring investment from partners, a muscle that needs to be worked at. So earlier, romance was a temporary escape from stability, all about risk and sizzle in many ways. Stability was the default situation. And this was actually breaking the stability. Today, it's almost like craving stability and comfort in short bursts, not forever, not finding it forever, because getting sort of, in a sense, over a certain relationship, but seeking stability nevertheless, looking for all the upsides of commitment, but very often in short-term relationships. So, today, taking much more romantic responsibility for one's own romantic destiny, an attitude that soulmates are made, not found, romance as the couple drive to extricate themselves from familial collective destinies, that is at a larger level, that is what is happening. It's a means of experience, a category of living, travel, fashion, entertainment. That's how it's a means of actually enjoying the world in a certain way. And advent of romantic partnerships where each other's well-being is something you nurture. But overall, this is romance as work. This is not romance only as pleasure. This is romance which you work at, which you struggle with, which you, so it has become, in that sense, it has a very different cadence and code to it as against the past. I think that is just what I wanted to cover. I hope there is still time for us to have a conversation. Please.
Thank you, Santosh. I think that was extremely interesting, and which is why we have a lot of questions as well that have come in. I'll let Shantan, would you like to take the lead with the Q&A?
Sure. Thanks, Adshri. So there's one question from Lakshmi Iyer, and she's saying that, yeah, am I audible completely? Cool. Yeah. So she's saying that nowadays women do have a supportive sisterhood, and whose shared realities form an understanding and a bond. It is, however, is not the same for men, and they have a problem with living up to the idea of the ideal male, even when it comes to romance. So what do you have to say about that?
I think that's absolutely true. I think that's absolutely true. Men historically have struggled with. They've not. For one, I think men have not had to articulate feelings, because there is a certain place in society that is given and so therefore there is a certain natural assumption of what their role is meant to be. But I think as that changes, as the world around them changes, and when roles get redefined, that ability to have those conversations, the vocabulary to have those conversations is lacking. And therefore, I think in general, we find this when we, not just in terms of romance, but even overall, we find much greater confidence when we travel the country and talk to young women as against talking to young men. Young men are confident in groups, but are absolutely tentative as individuals, in a general sense. Obviously, there are exceptions, but in a general sense, there is a tentativeness, there is a lack of clarity often, particularly in small town India. There is a difficulty in terms of being able to adjust to newer realities. Young women, partly because of the sisterhood, partly because there is an ability historically also to think about these things much more, even though not in the public domain, much more thought through. So I think you find that's an absolutely valid observation, that there is a difference in the way, and men today, because there is expectations from them, which we always look at one side of patriarchy as to what it means for women, but for men equally are implicated in the same set of expectations, and I think for them to deal with that, and to deal with also the expectations of relationships where there is actually, they have meant to do something. They can't just be. Earlier you could just be. Now you actually have to understand, you have to act in a certain way. That turns out to be quite difficult. So I think we do see an asymmetry there.
Thank you. So another interesting insight coming from Ria, who is saying that movies from 1990s like Ishq, there are also one more depiction of romance, which is the freedom of teasing and the girl easily falling for that love. This depiction shows that girls no means not no, and then when it got exaggerated with things like rape and acid attacks, it is taking a while to make people understand no means no. What is your opinion on these type of depiction and interpretation of romance?
That is true. I think there was a time, I think if you look at the 80s, 90s, I mean, there were a bunch of films where the idea of what today would be seen, and even up to later, I mean, there are people who argued the same for films like Ranjana, that what you have done is taken stalking and you kind of glorified it as a form of romance. And I think again, it's about, it is set in a certain social milieu where there was a certain expectation of what the boy was meant to. And it's not just that time, actually. You go back earlier, and you will find equally this idea of the Shammi Kapoor style of, for instance, romance, again, which is the much more aggressive, as somebody has called it, it's almost a phallic kind of physically, it is almost like using the body as a phallic symbol virtually. It is that you're kind of shaking, moving, So there was a time when I think that code, the idea of pursuing the woman, the idea of the woman, inherent in it is the idea that woman does not know her own mind. And that mind can be changed by aggressive pursuing. And that idea of the woman fundamentally not having agency, not having, the ability to think for herself. Through, in fact, even if you look up to Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, and later, the idea that the girl in question does not have the ability to stand up for herself. She may be able to think for herself, but she's not able to stand up for herself. I think there is a gradual change that you see over a period of time. But certainly in that period, it was perhaps at its, at the most sort of asymmetrical in that sense of saying women can't think for themselves, so men can persuade them. They just have to try harder. And there are no boundaries drawn.
Thank you. There's another question from some anonymous attendee, and he's asking about the new age technologies and dating apps like Tinder and Bumble. I think Mr. Desai has already talked about it. But another interesting part is he's talking about is how romance and lust is getting interlinked in the contemporary times, and now it is getting entangled. Are we staring at cultural evolution related to sexual liberation, which delinks romance from sex?
We're beginning to see that. I think we're beginning to see that, certainly. I mean, and the fact that, one is, able to talk about flings, for instance, or one is able to, talk about hookups. I mean, if you just look at vocabularies also, the fact that one is able to talk about that suggests that there is that delinking that is certainly underway. I am not sure I would characterize it as a sexual revolution yet, because I think it is extremely uneven in terms of the way that it happens, but it is beginning to happen. And I think it is a natural consequence of the fact that, of this, the more experimental mode of finding partners. And in any case, this is a complicated sort of a subject. In any case, the relationship, you could argue that in India, historically, sex happened before romance. And in fact, sex happened and romance could never have happened, very often in marriages, right? So sex has actually been dealing from romance always. But that was, in a collective sense, it was dealing, societally, it was dealing actually. Sex happened first. Romance was optional, right? Today, it is being delinked at an individual level. But in that sense, sex and romance in India have never been, sex as the culmination of romance is an alien idea, if you come to think about it.
Thank you. So there's also, when you're talking about contemporary vocabularies, there's one question posted by a user called AC. He's talking about how the pain of unrequited love, the pain and pleasure point of unrequited love, how we can look into it.
No, I think that is a very, so if you look at, the pain and pleasure, I think is well said, because I think there is there is pain, but there is also certain wallowing in that pain, which is a form of pleasure. And I think historically, of course, that was the dominant face of love. I mean, that's why the best Hindi film songs are the ones that are pining for love, rather than that are talking about love that exists, right? It is about, what might have been more than what is. So I think that at a universal level, there is a certain sort of bittersweetness to the idea of lost love or unrequited love. And I think that is a universal, timeless kind of an idea in many ways. I think today you find, however, its expressions are, I think, less poignant, less kind of, and because there is a sense that if not this, then there is always the next opportunity. So I think, again, in a social context where opportunities for love and romance were very few, even the loss of an imagined love, you could nurse that heartbreak for the rest of your life. That if only it had been, whereas you had not got even to the first base of any kind with the other person, you could have that. Today, I think the need to have that is lower. It doesn't change the fact that when unrequited love exists and when it is intense, that feeling, there is a pleasure and pain associated with that. I think as a human emotion, has an element of timelessness to it.
I think another question, I guess everybody who attended this webinar is looking for some sort of answer of this question, where Ankur Kapoor is asking, just a minute, yeah. What is your sense on the future of romance? I mean, when you're looking about evolution, it's always, interesting to look at how it is going to be. So what is your take upon that?
I'm extremely wary of talking about the future of anything, because I think, the future is an ecological kind of an entity where, where so many things happen, and it's impossible to talk about where it'll go. But I do think that, if you think about the fact that there is a growing vocabulary of romance, I do think that, it's tempting to think of it in terms of at one level of maturing, but I also is wary of, that's a linear idea, so I'm a little wary of it. But at one level, certainly one strand of it is the fact that you are actually investing in each other, you are actually learning about each other. Actually, today's sort of romantic journey is actually a journey in self-discovery also. So the fact that you make that investment in the other person, you take that time, I think there is something that certainly is a deepening that is happening. But simultaneously, the opposite is happening, right? Because the pressures and pulls are so many. and the fact that therefore permanence. So I think what you are likely to see are deeper, less permanent relationships. So you will see both deeper relationships, but which are not, but which are more transient. You certainly will see a higher, divorce rates in India. Of that, I will say, because as you actually move away from role-based relationships to individual-based relationships, the fact that there will be many things to like and many things to dislike about somebody, and there is a relatively hair trigger kind of a reaction now. Also, the social sort of cost of breakups and failed relationships. In fact, you don't think of it as a failure. You think of it as virtually as a milestone in a relationship rather than as a failure of a relationship. So I think that is something that one is likely to see. But I do think that the other challenge, I think, for this generation overall is this. I think I do also see a counterpoint emerging where, which is not just about romance, but overall about things slowing down a little, because I think the pressure right now and the number of variables that this generation has to deal with are unhealthy and are difficult. And I do think that some sort of counterpoint that kind of releases this pressure is something that is awaited, because otherwise the mental health as an issue, I think, is something that is going to become a really large sort of an issue. So I probably answered a little sort of all over the question, but yeah, that's my response.
Shantan, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Sorry. Thanks. So just picking up the last question, where somebody has asked around brands. So he's asking, in a society where still a large section of society associates romance with femininity and engaging in it being an almost taboo for males, how do brands walk in the line and engage with their male audience without alienating them?
I challenge the premise of the question. I don't think that is true. I don't think that this is a society where men are. I think men are as. I mean, they may not. They may not. Kind of. Make necessarily be that tuned into making grand romantic gesture. But I mean, wherever you see today, you see on social media, wherever you see, men are hardly unwilling participants in the idea of romance. They are as invested in the idea of romance as women are. So I do not buy the premise of the question that somehow romance is a more feminine idea than male idea. Yes, I mean, historically that is there is a depiction and there is an archetypal depiction of that women like to talk about romance, like to talk about feelings, and men don't. That is, I mean, but within that, the idea that both are invested in romance, I don't think there is. Their modes of expression might not be the same, but the fact that they're both invested in romance, I don't think there is a doubt in my mind. And there are so many brands that are that deal with romance, which are easily sort of talk to their male. It's hardly as if that you will alienate men if you talk about romance. I mean, that I certainly don't think is true.
Thank you, Mr. Desai, for your valuable insights. Now I would like to invite Adishri to take this forward. Adishri, over to you.
Yeah, hi. So yes, I mean, we still have many more questions, but we had to pick a few that were pertinent, since you've answered a lot of them already. But this was very insightful, very engaging, and clearly our audience has really found it very interesting as well. So thank you for taking out time for this today. Rajesh, would you want to say a few words?
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much, Santosh. I mean, this has been fascinating, and it's just I think the evolution of romance. I think fascinating insight. So yeah, I'm sure all of us, got great, understanding of this particular phenomenon. And to me, as a somebody who works in qualitative research, I think it just shows the power of contextualized findings, right? So I mean, with the cultural nuances and the context coming through so clearly, and therefore making a story which is so Indian. So thank you so much for putting this all together in such a really nice way that all of us can understand and appreciate. So thank you so much for your time. I wanted to thank everyone else also on the panel, especially Adishri, Shantan, for putting in all the effort for making this possible today. Thank you, Tanvi, as well, and thank you for everyone who attended. Really appreciate the fact that you could take time out and attend this particular seminar, this particular webinar. I wanted to leave the last word with Santosh, and I think I'm just going back to a question that somebody asked. So that person is an anonymous attendee who asks, I am curious as to how you came to be interested in the different angles of romance in India. So Santosh, the last word is with you.
No, not particularly. I can't say that I was particularly interested in this subject, but we did some work recently, looking at youth attitudes. And the one most striking thing that I found about it, was this idea that somehow I felt that romance was the site of the most amount of active negotiation that is taking place. So the workplace is another site where there is shifts happening, but you don't have. You don't have power. So as an individual, you don't have power to negotiate it. You can respond to what is happening, but if you were to look at one space where a maximum amount of change that is happening through almost this democratic interaction and negotiation, relationships seems to be the area that seemed to be the most fertile area where things were actually being talked through and arrived at, and that was fascinating actually about it. So which is the reason why at this late stage in my life, I've been thinking about romance.
Sure. So thank you so much, everyone, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye bye. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Enjoyed that.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.